Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Getting Ready for the Rain, Integrating and Implementing Nature-Based Solutions into State and Local Hazard Mitigation Plans, Part 2. My name is George Burgos and I'll be managing the technical aspects of today's webinar. While we wait for the others to log on, I'll be managing the technical aspects of today's webinar. While we wait for the others to log on, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. By now, you should have the GoToWebinar application running and should see the welcome presentation on your screen. If you're having technical difficulties using GoToWebinar, you can go to www.gotowebinar.com and click on the frequently asked questions in the blue navigation bar on the left side of the page. The presentation slides will be advanced by this presenter. Note, a copy of the slides are also in your handout box. We encourage you to ask questions. Please use the GoToWebinar control panel and type your questions in the area that says questions and click send to submit it to the moderator. Please type your questions throughout the presentation. After today's webinar, there will be a short evaluation. Please take a moment to fill it out. Your feedback and suggestions are vital to helping us provide the highest quality speakers and information to meet your needs, as well as to get your suggestions for future webinars. Please take a moment to read the disclaimer. EPA doesn't officially endorse or recommend any trade names or commercial products that may be mentioned in this webinar. Before we get started, we'd like to ask a few poll questions to find out about who's attending and what is your background. What organizations, if any, are you representing today? Education, academia, government agency, federal, state, or local, private sector, business, non-governmental organization, or other. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to close and I'm going to share the results. 4% education, academia, 41% government agency, federal, state, local, 40% private sector, business, 10% non-governmental organization, and 5% other. Okay, we're going to do two more polls. How do you often typically interact with hazard mitigation planning? Never, seldom, rarely, occasionally, somewhat regularly, frequently, majority of my job. Okay, I'm going to close and I'm going to share the results. 9% said never, 40% said seldom, rarely, 37% occasionally or somewhat regularly, and 13% frequently or the majority of my job. I'm going to do one last one, and then we'll continue with the webinar. What is your knowledge, experience with integrating nature-based GI, green infrastructure approaches into hazard mitigation planning? No experience, some knowledge but no implementation experience, knowledge but limited experience with implementation, or a pro, extensive knowledge and experience. Okay, thank you. I'm going to close and share. 15% no experience, 40% some knowledge but no implementation experience, 42% knowledge but limited experience with implementation, and 3% are pros, exclusively extensive knowledge and experience. Thank you. And now we're going to resume. Today's webinar will be moderated by both Myra Schwartz from the Office of Assistance in Pollution Prevention here at EPA New England. I will now turn this over to Myra.
Hi, well, welcome everyone. I'm glad to see such high attendance from all over the country. We have three great speakers today, starting with Sarah White. Sarah White. She's the State Mitigation Officer for the Massachusetts MEMA office. Sarah's a program manager with diverse experience and outreach programs. And she's grant management, emergency operations, risk assessment, local and state level planning initiatives. She co-chairs the project management team developing the first ever integrated state hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan. This integrated plan, which is currently under development, serves an update to the state's existing 2013 State Hazard Mitigation Plan, and is also driven by the state's executive order establishing an integrated climate change strategy for the state. So we also have Margot Mansfield, who's a climate change and coastal hazards analyst with the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, EEA, and Office of Coastal Zone Management, CZM. She's a program lead for EEA with the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, and leads EEA's work on integrating the new statewide climate change projections into the Massachusetts State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan and the Coastal Resilience Project, developing a monitoring protocol and guidance for living shoreline projects in coastal New England. Margot has a Master's of Science in Earth Science from the University of Maine and a Bachelor's of Science in Earth and Space Science from the University of Washington. And finally, we have Lauren Oates, who's a State Hazard Mitigation Officer for Vermont. In this role, she manages the FEMA Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grants Program, as well as the development and implementation of Vermont's State Hazard Mitigation Plan. She works closely with state agencies, municipalities, and nonprofit organizations throughout the state. Lauren's work aims to reduce the impacts of natural hazards by decreasing Vermont's vulnerability to them. Much of her time is spent collaborating with key stakeholders to promote flood resilience efforts like floodplain restoration and other nature-based solutions. Science and Biology from the University of Maryland, and the Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Clemson University. We also have Melissa Surratt, who's here in our office today. She's a senior planner and team lead for mitigation planning with the FEMA office, Region 1, who will be here to help answer questions during the Q&A session. So we'll begin with Sarah, who will be also co-moderating with me. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, how are you? I hope you can hear me all right. I'm going to just get started here by talking a little bit about hazard mitigation planning at the state level, and then talk a little bit more about our process and adventure of what we've gone through in Massachusetts in the last 18 months or so. You can go to the next slide, Lauren. Just a little bit in terms of background. So it was really great to view the poll questions and see that, you know, some number of the folks on the line have a background or some familiarity with hazard mitigation, but maybe don't do it day to day. So one of the things that I was hoping to just offer you is a little bit of context to how this all works together in terms of climate adaptation and hazard mitigation. At the State Emergency Management Agency and across the country, state emergency management agencies work with FEMA to develop a statewide hazard mitigation plan. This is done for a number of reasons. A couple of the regulations listed on the slide show you either why it's done in terms of for eligibility for the FEMA recovery grants. So certainly after you have a disaster event in your area, FEMA will assist communities and states rebuild. Those permanent work projects, basically those projects that are shovels in the ground, repairing a road or a bridge or a water treatment facility that's damaged, is called a permanent work project. And in order for the state to maintain their eligibility to receive those funds from FEMA, a state hazard mitigation plan is required for the state, and it needs to be updated every 5 years and approved by the FEMA region. In addition to the public assistance funding, which is the largest sort of pot of money that this makes states eligible for, it is also the 3 FEMA hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. Those are more commonly called PDM, FMA, and HMGP, but trying to stay away from the alphabet soup for you, Many of you may have heard of hazard mitigation grants or FEMA grants. These are grants that are typically available for cities and towns, as well as eligible nonprofits or special districts, to do long-term sustainable mitigation type projects, not climate mitigation, but structural hazard mitigation. And having this plan in place, again, is a requirement of being able to receive those funds at the state level, but also at the local level. And there's a few other things. So for those of you who are in the emergency management world, you may be aware of the Emergency Management Accreditation Program. This is a national accreditation program where states or local governments or local organizations such as colleges or others prove through a certain set of standards that they have a comprehensive emergency management program. And so one way that states and locals would meet this requirement is by having a comprehensive risk analysis for all of their hazards. You can go to the next slide. As Myra mentioned in my introduction, we are really proud to say that Massachusetts is the first state in the country where a comprehensive FEMA approved, we did receive our FEMA approval in September, for our 2018 State Hazard Mitigation and Climate Adaptation Plan. It's the first plan in the country that looks at the hazards in terms of what has existed in the past based on previous data, previous occurrences, looking at information that we can find on databases such as through NOAA's Atlas and things of that nature. But also, our state has climate downscale modeling data for 3 different climate interactions, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But we received that FEMA approval, and we're really proud of it. And actually, in 2 weeks, we're going to be awarded a comprehensive planning award by the American Planning Association's Massachusetts chapter for outstanding work in comprehensive planning. And I'm really excited to say that to you all, because for those of you who are not in emergency management on this call, the American Planning Association does have quite a bit of information and webinars and such around this idea of integrating hazard planning into land use planning. And so we really feel like we're paving the way at the state level for some of that work. You can go to the next slide. Great. So something that I just wanted to share with the audience was that, you know, this plan and this whole process that we undertook, and Margot, I believe, is going to talk a little bit about our state executive order that drove a little bit of this at the state level. But we did run into some challenges, and that was we had some terminology that we had to deal with. We had some issues related to some of the time horizons for some of these events. And so we had to wrestle with that. And I don't want to make it sound like it was an easy process. It really took over 2 years of working very closely with stakeholders to try to understand the best way that we can make actionable goals and objectives for our state, for things that may not affect us really for the next 30 years yet. But while we're making investments, we have to think of these things now. Next slide, please. The way that we laid out our analysis for our risk assessment was we looked at some climate changes. And on this slide, there's just 2, but it's changes in precipitation and sea level rise. And what we did was we related that analysis back to known hazards, things that we always plan for on a regular basis, like inland flooding, drought, landslide. And we then took those projections and we were able to make assumptions and be able to provide some very detailed information for our state agencies who are going to be coming up with actions for these, but also our cities and towns, so that we can understand some of the impacts. You can go to the next slide. Okay, and then the last thing I just want to leave off with was an emphasis on nature-based solutions. So one of the things that we realized through this effort is that climate adaptation and hazard mitigation share a lot of similarities. And the most important thing is that we're concerned about the conditions related to weather and related to natural hazards. And both wish to minimize those risks. And so one of the things that we highlighted in our plan was the emphasis on nature-based solutions. So the next presenters are going to give you some specific examples of ways from the state level we've taken this approach that we have these plans and how are we putting them into action. And just giving you a little bit of a definition here on your screen about nature-based solutions. This is the adopted definition that we use in Massachusetts. Nature-based solutions in Massachusetts, as well as in Vermont, very similarly, we talk about things like restoring wetlands to reduce flooding, the utilization of green infrastructure to manage stormwater rather than gray engineered infrastructure, or incorporating it where possible. Another element might be planting trees in an area to reduce the urban heat island effect or heat in general. And then last, and one of the hardest to sometimes achieve is conserving and managing, agricultural land as well as soils as a way to not only potentially be flood storage or wildlife habitat, but also can assist in carbon sequestration, which overall, will reduce some of those impacts to the climate overall. So with that, I'm going to pause and turn it back over to you, Margot.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, here we go. Okay, I will be speaking today about the Massachusetts Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, or the MVP program, as an example of how the Commonwealth is integrating and implementing nature-based solutions at the local level. Also, a brief program overview, an example of how one community approached the planning exercise, and finish by providing some examples how communities are moving from planning to implementing nature-based solutions for their identified priority adaptation strategies for climate change resilience. So the inception of the program can be traced back to Governor Baker's signing of Executive Order 569, which was issued over 2 years ago now. The order was to further the Commonwealth's efforts at reducing greenhouse gas emissions to combat climate change. Sarah already touched on the state plan process, but on the local level, the MVP program is a means to provide technical and financial support to communities to prepare for the impacts of climate change. More recently, earlier this year, a $2.4 billion bond bill was signed by the legislature, and this had a major focus on climate change resiliency. This piece of legislation authorizes over $500 million for climate change adaptation, and importantly, it codified Executive Order 569, including the MVP program. To support the MVP program and other state and local initiatives, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs released a climate change clearinghouse for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You can see the web address there on the bottom if you go to resilientma.org. Among the resources on this clearinghouse are sector-specific information pages and how climate change is expected to affect those various sectors in Massachusetts. You can also explore the downscaled climate projections that were developed by the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and those can be explored via multiple data platforms. The MVP program began as a grant program to help communities engage in identifying climate change hazards and impacts and complete an assessment of town assets for vulnerabilities but also strengths, and develop and prioritize these actions for adaptation strategies. The program is a community-led process made to leverage local knowledge and expertise and creates a ground-up support for local climate adaptation. The framework we use is the Community Resilience Building Workshop Guide, shown on the right side there, and it was developed by the Nature Conservancy. This framework is accessible and flexible for communities at any scale, especially as an initial or early planning phase. The state partnered with TNC and Mass Audubon to train over 320 service providers for implementing the planning framework in Massachusetts. and also introducing the downscaled projections and providing modules on nature-based solutions, climate communication, and tie-ins with traditional hazard mitigation planning. The MVP approach is an attempt to mainstream climate change into existing planning, and it informs and guides coordinated statewide efforts and allocation of resources. So this is just a snapshot of what the planning process looks like. You can visit communityresiliencebuilding.com for more details. But essentially, the process culminates in a community workshop attended by a broad cross-section of municipal staff, residents, partners, including watershed groups and other environmental NGOs. And participants are tasked with identifying top climate hazards for their community and evaluating vulnerabilities and strengths across 3 sectors. So we're looking at infrastructural, societal, and environmental, and then identify and prioritize community actions and adaptation strategies. This is a map showing community participation in the MVP program in Massachusetts. You can see that since the program began in 2017, we already have over 40% of the Commonwealth participating. The blue shades there indicate which communities have completed their initial planning phase in the dark blue, and which are in the process right now in the light blue. We even have a few communities who elected to conduct the planning process as a regional partnership, which are indicated by the cross-hatching there. While the final output for the MVP planning grant is a summary of findings report following community workshops and follow-up public forums, and thus achieving MVP community designation, municipalities must complete yearly progress reports outlining the steps they have taken towards implementing those priority actions. We're pretty flexible on what counts as steps or progress, but the major goal here is that the planning process isn't the finish line, but rather a blueprint for continued community action. Bringing this back to today's topic of nature-based solutions, I mentioned earlier that during the training of service providers, we included a module on nature-based solutions. TNC led this module, and this schematic from TNC shows some nature-based solutions to climate change impacts that communities face, and also includes some multi-benefit components of implementing those solutions. We encouraged communities to make sure they had representatives from environmental NGOs, conservation commissions, town staff from land use, zoning, planning, and parks and rec departments, and related boards and commissions to attend these workshops to ensure that there was an opportunity of incorporating a discussion on nature-based solutions when identifying those priority actions and adaptation strategies, especially when moving beyond the general climate resilience planning phase. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and show an example of how this MVP planning process played out for one Massachusetts community and how nature-based solutions figured into this process. This example comes from the town of Natick. You can see from the insert here that Natick is located in the greater metro Boston area, in the gold yellow star there, approximately 17 miles west from Boston, represented by the red star. The town has a population of approximately 33,000 and has a representative town meeting form of local government with a board of selectmen and a town administrator. The town of Natick completed their planning process via 2 community workshops. The planning process for the town was led by their sustainability coordinator. And one of the messages that she's promoted in reflecting on the planning process was how important it was to invite the right people. Approximately 40 participants from the town departments, committees, and boards, state agencies, community organizations, businesses, and other interest groups were in attendance at each of their 2 workshops. And the background of workshop participants, they felt, were balanced across the 3 different community features assessed, so the infrastructure, environmental, and societal. And you can see that reflected in the pie chart there at the top right of the screen. Precipitation-based and riverine flooding, higher temperatures, and severe drought were among the identified top climate hazards for the town. The major areas of concern for these hazards included neighborhoods, ecosystems, transportation, and infrastructure. But the process wasn't all about vulnerabilities. The town also recognized that large spaces such as their Mass Audubon Broadmoor Wildlife Sanctuary, Lookout Farm, Natick Community Farm, and the Sassamon Trace Golf Course were community strengths for flood storage and recharging groundwater resources, as well as reducing local heat islands and providing cooling spaces for people and wildlife. Yet, one of the key challenges that was raised during the workshop was the lack of awareness amongst residents of the benefits and critical services provided by wetlands. So they thought that the wetlands and riparian areas weren't being valued and incorporated as natural infrastructure that can help reduce risk and improve resilience. Here is an example of some of their high priority actions that the town identified through their MVP planning process. I selected some of those that have tie-ins to incorporating nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, showed by the green stars there, to mitigate flooding and heat. The town even went so far as identifying lead departments to take on specific actions and identified other entities to support those actions. One of the challenges the town found in gardening support for implementing nature-based solutions was a discomfort about moving away from gray infrastructure, which was a much more familiar approach. And so questions about what would they do if nature-based solutions approaches fail still linger. And so I feel looking at the efficacy of these approaches that have been implemented will be extremely useful to help pave the path for a wider adoption. So most of what I've touched on so far was the MVP planning process. Earlier this year, we were fortunate to see the program grow to incorporate a second grant to help implement those priority actions resulting from the planning process. The MVP action grants are meant to be one funding stream to help move the planning process into on-the-ground change in communities. And these grants do have a preference for projects that utilize nature-based strategies, including green infrastructure, and that are proactive to help build long-term resilience. Here's some of the categories of MVP action grants that we offered last round. They include undertaking more detailed vulnerability and risk assessments, and this could be targeted at a specific sector or geographic area within the municipality, public education and communication, updating, amending, or creating local bylaws, ordinances, and plans, designing, permitting, and constructing redesigns and retrofits, and ecological restoration, habitat management. We also had a few categories specifically for nature-based solutions, including proposals seeking to provide storm damage protection, drought prevention, water quality, and water infiltration techniques to reduce vulnerability to extreme heat and poor air quality and other climate change impacts. Finally, here are a few examples of funded projects explicitly incorporating nature-based solutions and green infrastructure techniques on the left. These include developing a drainage model and conceptual strategies to reduce future flooding, developing green infrastructure designs to mitigate storm damage, and retrofitting a parking lot to reduce urban heat island effects. I've also included a column on the right to show what other projects that, while they don't explicitly incorporate nature-based solutions in the current project phase, I believe there is opportunity to do so on follow-on project phases. So in conclusion, we're very excited to have the level of participation in the MVP program to date, both in the initial planning grant phase and in the follow-on action grant phase. And it is our goal to for every Massachusetts community to participate. And to that end, the Baker-Polito administration has already committed over $7 million to this program, and we do expect continued support. So thank you, and you can find my contact here and those of my colleagues, and I will turn things back over to Sarah.
Excellent, thank you. And so transitioning a little bit off of a Massachusetts example, what we focused on was the MVP project, which is a specific type of Massachusetts-based project. I want to transition to our neighbors just over the border in the north to Vermont, who's going to talk a little bit about a way that from the state level they've been incorporating some nature-based solutions into or throughout their hazard mitigation planning process. So Lauren?
Thank you, Sarah. I was actually going to go over all of the good work that you did in your intro to describe the high-level principles of mitigation planning, but you just did that. Thanks also to Margot for describing the MVP approach down in Massachusetts. It's definitely something that Vermont is interested in and watching closely and hopefully learning from as well. So to everybody on the line, my name is Lauren Oates. I'm the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for Vermont, if you did not hear the introduction earlier. I'm going to go into, like Sarah said, a couple of specific examples of nature-based solutions and planning efforts that are happening in Vermont, which is a little bit different, though, as Sarah said, just over the border to the north, we are a far more rural state. So our approaches are, though often similar, we also have a couple of different things to consider up here. When I was asked to be a presenter on this, Myra Schwartz at the EPA mentioned that this would be a national webinar, and so I should give a little bit of information on the state just to set the setting for you all. So for those that don't know, Vermont is, here's a little bit of Vermont trivia. We are the second least populated state with about 630,000 people according to the 2010 census. That's equivalent to the cities of Las Vegas and Baltimore, to give you a little bit of an idea of how small we are. We are also small in size, 45th largest state, and we are very, very forested, 73% so. I put mountainous, and I realize friends to the west that are on might laugh at that, but we are a part of the Appalachian range, and we have a very mountainous topography here, which leads to a very specific setting of our village development pattern. So most of our villages, as you can see in this image, often are forced into the flattest land, which is often very close to our rivers and brooks and streams. And therefore, we have, again, because of that development pattern, but also because of our topographic setting, our primary hazards that we face, natural hazards, are fluvial erosion and flooding. I should also mention that the riverine fluvial erosion and riverine flooding, those are the top two. We do also have a very large lake to our west, which borders New York, Lake Champlain, and we do on that lake experience phenomenon very similar to coastal flooding. So we do some coastal flooding, coastal erosion issues in Vermont as well. Similar to Massachusetts also, Vermont just underwent their state hazard mitigation plan update process, which was also about an 18-month event, which included a great deal of federal, state, local, and nonprofit partners. One benefit of living in a small state is having access to a lot of these different people and the different organizations, and they can work very closely together. So following Tropical Storm Irene in 2011 and the spring 2011 floods that immediately preceded Tropical Storm Irene, Vermont saw widespread devastation from both flooding and fluvial erosion across the state. With that devastation, it took a long time to recover, and we actually still have plenty of ongoing projects in the state 8 years later, or 7 years later, excuse me. We also saw a huge influx of federal aid, and with that aid, new ideas that allowed us to really step back from the event and consider ways to not necessarily build back as we were, but to build a little bit better, a little bit smarter than before, so that we could avoid future devastation at that range. As part of the state planning efforts, we used a pretty great committee. Again, it had federal, state, nonprofit, some locals on the steering committee, and we came up with a pretty significant list of mitigation actions that the state should be undergoing. We whittled it down to 96 state-level priorities. 24 of those were determined to be high priority, and then within those 24, we yielded our top 5 priority mitigation actions. And I've listed them here, but the two that we're going to focus on are the two that are bolded and italicized, which are the inventorying and protection of critical headwater and floodplain storage areas, and also the collaboration across flood resilience, water quality, and habitat connectivity programs and funding, both of which I'll get into in a moment, but are definitely heavily based in the nature-based solutions approach. because there is a tendency for planning initiatives, planning efforts, and just work in general for organizations and entities to work within our individual silos, we often unintentionally create a disservice in the fields of mitigation and nature-based solutions, that we aren't able necessarily to go cross-sector and work with one another to make sure that we're identifying potential ways that our organizations and our focuses can help one another. So one of the most important top two of the top 5 of the 96 actions was to connect water quality and flood mitigation co-benefits. So Vermont is undergoing this effort to connect these 2 initiatives, as flooding and water quality are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, often have compounding impacts on one another. So the above image that you can see here depicts the Otter Creek. Its inlet to Lake Champlain, which I mentioned earlier. You can visibly see the nutrient deposition into the lake, which was primarily caused by farm and stormwater runoff immediately upstream. The nutrient influx can then cause cyanobacterial or blue-green algae, for those of you that listen to it that way, blooms in the lake, which are a primary driver of the total maximum daily load, or TMDL, efforts and legislation that are going on around Lake Champlain and several other places across the country. So I described earlier the topography of Vermont. So if you can just imagine a spine of mountains goes right from south to north, Massachusetts, all the way up to Canada, and Lake Champlain is off to the west of that. This river, therefore, only has a little bit of space, the Otter Creek, to collect all of the water that's coming off the steep slopes of the Green Mountains and figure out where its best floodplain is to divert its energy and also store and deposit nutrients. And oftentimes, because of our development patterns and because of our farms, there isn't that much space for that to happen, that natural filter of nutrients. So we do have this event in Lake Champlain, and this isn't specific only to the Otter Creek. It's many different rivers a lot across the state. Now, if we're able to identify critical parcels along our rivers for land conservation, for land that has not yet been developed, oftentimes farms, and buyouts of land that have actual physical structures on them. And we can closely partner with our agricultural community, which is really key here, and it has elicited a lot of interest, but also success in Vermont in connecting these 2 initiatives, while also encouraging natural plantings and riparian buffers along our river and stream banks. We can have these co-benefits that I keep discussing, which allow us to not only reduce nutrient runoff and improve water quality, but to reduce the erosion that's exacerbating that event. So one of the key success stories that Vermont totes following Tropical Storm Irene was a large-scale effort along this river that I just mentioned, the Otter Creek, a floodplain restoration project there, which is a really good example of a success story in Vermont for a nature-based solution. So this effort that took several years to undergo, identify different easements for conservation along retired farms, which required a great deal of outreach to our farming community, to our private landowners, and to several business owners who own property, large swaths of property right along the Otter Creek. It also involved plugging ditches that were intended to drain wetlands originally, removal of large berms. One was several tens of miles long, and also to promote native vegetation planting along the banks of the Otter Creek. Very interestingly, and this is why, again, we use this as our gold star of floodplain restoration and nature-based solutions in Vermont, there was a University of Vermont Gund Institute study that took place for this project that determined the efforts that underwent the Otter Creek Floodplain Restoration Project, found that the town of Middlebury, which is in Addison County, again, it's squeezed between the Green Mountains and Lake Champlain, they were able to document $1.8 million in avoided damages during Tropical Storm Irene. They've also found that this annually amounts to about $126,000 to $450,000 And the reason that I say conservative is because this study really only considered structures and businesses and did not even take into account infrastructure, road-based damages, which are often the most costly. So this is a very, very conservative estimate, and still 1.8 million, the town of Middlebury was able to be saved from Tropical Storm Irene. So this is an approach that Vermont likes to discuss often when promoting floodplain restoration across the state, and as part of that state hazard mitigation planning process, really was a support for that top priority to identify those critical storage areas across the state that we should be conserving and intending to restore floodplains and wetlands to their natural function. And finally, I wanted to talk about a really neat effort that was also a part of the state mitigation plan update, which is called the Transportation Resilience Planning Tool. So this was an effort that was primarily led by the Vermont Agency of Transportation. It was funded through several different funding sources, including the State Plan Update Grant, that targeted 3 different pilot watersheds in Vermont that have significant road infrastructure that are vulnerable to flooding and fluvial erosion. It underwent a pretty extensive criticality and vulnerability assessment. And the most interesting thing, and the reason why I wanted to talk to you all about it today, is that typically when we consider infrastructure damage for flood and fluvial erosion events, one, they're very, very costly, and the standard approach to repair and mitigation are generally hard fixes to the infrastructure itself. So we think of culvert upsizing, bridge span lengthening, other projects that are immediately touching or immediately adjacent to the road infrastructure itself. The interesting thing about this tool, which I'm going to pull up in just a moment to show you, but I recommend writing down this URL if you get a moment, is that it goes beyond just considering hard infrastructure fixes and considers a more holistic approach to mitigation of road segments and road infrastructure by considering nature-based solutions. So if you can imagine, if you're looking at the image on your screen, several areas along this road were damaged from fluvial erosion. If you can imagine different culverts that might have been there, different debris catching mechanisms that you might otherwise input, you can also say, well, let's look downstream or let's look upstream at the headwater. Are there any areas there that have been confined or filled that are not allowing the river to access its natural floodplain and release that energy? If we can find those areas and identify critical storage areas, we can do those floodplain restoration efforts that I talked about with Otter Creek as an example, that can allow the water to find its natural place instead of taking out our road infrastructure. So I'm going to hopefully pull it up, and I hope you can all see. Again, I recommend writing down this, this URL if you get a second. When you pull up the screen, you'll see there are 3 different watersheds. I'll zoom out really quickly so you can see them across the state. There are 2 right next to each other, and there's one farther north, and it might take a moment to load. But I wanted to zoom in on one to give you an example of the efforts that were underwent. And it's called a planning tool because it's a really good starting point for mitigation and transportation infrastructure planning and climate change planners to consider how to reduce our vulnerability. If you go over to this little section here, you can see that you can change the size of the rain event to a 10, 50, or 100-year event. We'll keep it at 50 year for now. You can copy a link and send to a friend or a colleague, and you can also change the layers to include the types of infrastructure that you want to consider. So culverts, you can include culverts, you can include bridges, you can highlight state, local, or all. So if we wanted to look at a certain section that's red, which would be considered highly vulnerable and critical, you can click on it. You can get some information on the river itself in this little box. And you can also go over to this table to the side, which gives an overall vulnerability and criticality score based on the different types of damage that it might incur in inundation, erosion, or deposition. And again, there are further drop downs, and I only have a few minutes, so I don't want to jump into everything. But the most interesting part, and the reason I want to share this with you, is that if you click on strategies, you can see in addition to river and road stabilization, which would have standard hard scale approaches like installing rock tow, armoring the road embankment, there are also floodplain protection and relocation efforts and improving vegetation. And it gives you an idea of the impact that would have. So this would be low and medium, adjust road alignment, river corridor conservation, a general cost associated with it per unit. And that's a really, really helpful starting point. So if you imagine being a planner, you're a planner for the town of Brattleboro, the Whetstone Brook watershed is all dumping down mountain into you before hitting the Connecticut River, and you want to understand your critical infrastructure, your road infrastructure, what segments are most vulnerable, and how you can best go about reducing your vulnerability in those sections. Then maybe not just consider what you can do hard infrastructure work, but also those nature-based solutions like floodplain restoration. We actually do have a project going on in Brattleboro that does floodplain restoration and is also aimed at one of these critical segments. So we're doing floodplain restoration. We actually aren't touching the road, and the road will be benefiting from it. And that's really all I have from Vermont is 2 specific examples of nature-based solutions. We have a lot of work to do and a lot of interested people to do it. So we're excited to see what the next 5 years of implementing our state plan are going to yield. So I guess back to Myra.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much. Great presentations. Now we're going to have time for questions, but before we do that, I'm going to hand things back to George Burgos, who's going to ask some poll questions. George?
Okay. Just give me 1 second. Here's our 4th poll question of the day. What are nature-based solutions? Projects that use nature to mitigate flooding, reduce multiple hazards, include open space conservation, all of the above, or none of the above?
We'll see how much you learned here.
And as the poll is still going on, just a reminder, the map that Lauren was showing you guys, I provided the link on the chat box, and also feel free to ask questions. We still got plenty of time. The webinar runs till 2:30, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and close and share the results. 1% said use nature to mitigate flooding. 0% reduce multiple hazards. 0 include open space conservation. 98% all of the above, and 1% none of the above. Okay, and the last one of the day. What do you think is the biggest barrier to integrating green infrastructure into hazard mitigation planning? Lack of resources and funding to implement green infrastructure practices, lack of information on the specific cost benefits of green infrastructure, lack of communication between city departments, or all of the above? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close and share. 10% said lack of resources and funding to implement green infrastructure practices, 9% lack of information on the specific cost benefits of green infrastructure. 7% lack of communication between city departments, and the biggest majority is 74% lack of all the above. And now we'll turn it to Myra.
Okay, very good. So it looks like you all did very well and learned a lot on this. We're going to first start with asking our presenters what they think is the biggest barrier, are the biggest barriers. You want to start, Sarah?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What do you think are the biggest barriers in implementing nature-based solutions and green infrastructure? And we'll ask each of you the same question.
Sure. So some of the things that we're hearing about from our local jurisdictions is just a lack of good information about the benefits. And one of the things that we hear from our local communities in Massachusetts especially, and I'm not sure if the same is true, is that there might be a lack of engineering expertise, trusted engineering expertise that's close to home for them. So maybe a community doesn't have a resident engineer and they have to rely on a hired firm to be able to design something. And if you know, they don't have a developed relationship with their engineering firm or consultant, they might be less apt to, you know, take on something that's out of the box thinking. We've seen, however, success in communities where they do have a developed relationship. So there's that trust there that, yes, we're designing this sort of out of the box thing for you, but it'll work and you can trust that it'll work. So it is really a human decision point that I'm seeing at that local level that we're hearing communities talk about. I mean, that's certainly not true for every city or town, and it's not true for every consulting firm, but again, that's just a little bit of what we've been hearing from some of our towns.
Oh, Margot?
Yeah, I think I will add to Sarah's answer in that, you know, and I think I sort of mentioned this in my presentation too, that in the case of one of the communities we've heard from, this discomfort from moving away from what is familiar in terms of implementing gray infrastructure towards these greener approaches, especially on the town departments, Department of Public Works and town engineers. So needing more monitoring of those projects that have been implemented to be able to demonstrate efficacy of these approaches. And right now, it is limited, especially when you get into the coastal regions. So yeah, that's how, I think that's where our biggest challenge is right now.
And Lauren?
I'll first second Sarah and say that there is definitely a lack of information, shareable and outreach and education on the benefits of nature-based solutions. But I'll also say that for the wetland and floodplain restoration approach that I mentioned, those efforts in Vermont rely very heavily on private landowner interest and buy-in. And without them, doing those buyouts or land conservation easements is nearly impossible. So if you have disinterested or uninformed private landowners, you often miss out on those critical land parcels that we're trying to target for restoration efforts. So creating some form of education and outreach material for the benefits of it, and then also having a good outreach strategy to those targeted private landowners is pretty critical.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so it's a question, I think for Sarah mainly. How do you communicate, or actually all of you can try answering this. Start with Sarah. How do communities engage in the MVP program planning process? Is it a competitive RFP process or an open rolling call for any interested municipality?
I'll turn that to Margot.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we do offer, we're trying to get towards a rolling RFP process. It is our goal to have full participation across the Commonwealth. So we have designed the application process to be pretty streamlined, and then in some cases, we're getting information up front before the planning process begins, and to be able to compare sort of the outcomes at the other end.
Okay, Lauren, did you want to say anything more about that?
No, Vermont hasn't done that MVP approach just yet.
Okay, with the nature-based solutions and hazard mitigation planning, are long-term maintenance practices being accounted for with cost estimates of projects? Good question. Maybe you want to try and answer?
Yeah, I'll start. This is Sarah White. So in terms of funding through the FEMA hazard mitigation grant programs, and for any of you on the call that might be familiar with those, a requirement for a construction project for HMGP, PDM, or FMA programs requires a cost-benefit analysis or a BCA analysis. And that's done through a FEMA software that looks at the costs of the project and compares that to the benefits or the damage that is expected to be reduced by doing the construction project. So one of the elements of that cost-benefit analysis that we do through those projects is we have to include maintenance costs and annual maintenance costs for the life of the project. So if it's a drainage project that might have a 20-year project useful life, we would have to include 20 years worth of an estimated annual maintenance cost in order to prove it's cost effective. Now, how that's done in funding through other sources and how that's considered if a community maybe isn't using the FEMA benefit cost software, you know, I can't say. I do know that it's often a challenge for communities to be able to commit to that long-term maintenance. And I'll just give one quick example. We have a community in Massachusetts, it's a coastal community that's looking to install a really great permeable parking lot. It's an area that's really right adjacent to a beach and a pier where they have a ton of just paved asphalt sidewalks and parking areas. It's a tourist area, so you want to have as an economic center a lot of places to put cars. And unfortunately, that's causing not only a water quality issue, but it's also causing a major stormwater management problem. So they're hoping to be able to install this type of a parking lot. The challenge that they're having, though, is the maintenance where it's a sandy area. It is subject to overwash. They would need to have a specific type of a vacuum truck to be able to do regular clean out of this permeable pavement for it to work properly. And those initial investments in terms of the truck and the attachments and then just the cost of the labor to go out and do it several times a year is seeming to be cost prohibitive to them in the short term. So it's something that they're really looking at, but it is that maintenance cost is proving to be a challenge for that particular community there.
Excellent. Here's a question for Lauren. Where did the funding for the mapping tool come from? Also, where is funding for the floodplain restoration coming from? Where does it?
Yeah, so the Transportation Resilience Planning Tool was funded in part by the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program planning grant for the Vermont State Mitigation Plan update. So that was one of those 3 grant programs that Sarah just mentioned. The Vermont Agency of Transportation also received funding from Federal Highway Administration to work on this, and then used some internal state funding sources as the match to develop that planning tool. For floodplain restoration, we try to tap into a lot of different resources. So again, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant programs through FEMA are a great place to start. And I'll put a little plug in to go one step further with Sarah's BCA, or benefit cost analysis, mention. A couple of years ago, relatively recently, FEMA actually created an addition or supplemental to the BCA called the Ecosystem Services Calculator, which allows you actually to, once you get past a certain threshold through the original BCA tool, to then incorporate those benefits that are gained from the ecosystem services that the project presents. So FEMA, giving them credit for them also recognizing that there is truly financial value and benefit in restoring our ecosystem, our floodplains and our wetlands. So for those floodplain restoration projects, we again use the FEMA mitigation assistance grants. We also have state-funded grant programs like our ecosystem restoration program and a couple of other things that we try to tap into.
Excellent. Can you please describe how you would track a nature-based proposal in the HMP through to implementation? Sarah, I think that would be a good question for you.
Okay, how would we track the project overall? So it sort of depends. I'll tell you how at the state level we would work in Massachusetts, and the way that I think it's done across the country is a little bit different. So if you're talking about, and I'll just take it in terms of that the question is asking me how would I track a hazard mitigation project or a mitigation project, nature-based solution or whatever, from the time it was sort of started and all the way through. So, sorry, so in our state plan, we have outlined a process for plan maintenance. This process for plan maintenance outlines a group of people in Massachusetts that are required to report on a quarterly basis on all of the projects that we're funding through the bond bill that Margot had mentioned, which is a very large source of funding for the Massachusetts state agencies to be able to begin to do this work on state property, or to be able to fund through grant projects through our cities and towns. So most communities, if you're at the local level, also have the requirement, and in their hazard mitigation plan, you tell us how you're going to track and monitor progress. That's a requirement of the plan itself, in fact. I will say it's a weakness in many plans because metrics are really difficult for communities to sort of wrap their arms around. You know, how are we going to track this? How are we going to evaluate it once it's in? Your plan is supposed to say how you're going to do it. Our state plan does. I know most state plans have a really robust approach with, and I know Lauren had mentioned it as well, a really great group of collaborative state partners from state agencies as well as our nonprofits. And that's the group in which, you know, you have to get together often and you have to communicate. One other example that I will give is we have a tracking tool that we've developed, and I know many other states and localities as well. We call it a tracking tool. It's really an Excel spreadsheet. But basically, that's one way in which we kind of keep track of things over that 5-year period till the next time we actually document our plan, to make sure that for all the actions that we have, we're reporting or tracking those progress steps. And so that's just sort of how I would define it in terms of that. And certainly if the question was meant to ask something different, you know, please feel free to ask it in a different way.
Excellent. Did anyone else have anything to say about that? Okay.
This is Lauren. I'll just jump in really quickly. Yeah. In an attempt to maybe answer it a little bit differently. And I think Sarah answered it quite well too. Something from the literal 30,000 foot view, if you're looking down on as a statewide approach. One of the things that I talked about earlier and didn't necessarily get to dive into with the state plan update for Vermont is that large scale identification of critical headwater storage areas and identified parcels for land conservation. So as part of that, we would want to come up with, as a state, again, a state approach with different entities and nonprofit organizations and state and federal partners as well, an actual list or database of those areas and prioritization criteria for where we want to aim our efforts first and go down that list. So as a statewide way to track progress and to identify those areas most critical.
Excellent. Someone has a question about the MVP program for municipalities that are not participants of the MVP program, especially those right on the water. Have you been able to identify what is preventing them from completing the program? For example, are there equity issues during the planning process which then inhibit these municipalities from accessing the grants?
Yeah, this is Margot. No, we don't have an issue with communities completing the grants after they've come in. But I have heard that one of the biggest challenges is just a lot of different things competing for town staff time. There's no, for the planning grants, there's no local match other than staff time. There's some range of hours that we sort of estimated at how much staff time would be needed to go through this. But the bulk of the grant is to hire one of those certified service providers to do the bulk of the work. You know, looking through existing documents of the town, conducting interviews with various town staff, and helping facilitate the workshops themselves and writing up the summary of findings report. So once communities have decided to come into the program, we have a very good success rate. But yes, I think those who haven't, it's a combination of just other things that are other grants or other priorities that are competing for time. And I know in large portions of the gap areas we have right now related to the staff time is many communities don't have full dedicated staff. They're working on a volunteer basis in some capacity. So that has been a challenge, and we are still trying to promote some outreach and letting them know that there are resources to help get through. And we find that the fact that we don't have a local financial match other than time, we feel is a benefit, and trying to get more communities to participate.
Excellent. Another maintenance question. Have you dealt with maintenance questions for nature-based solutions from municipal supervisors, such as maintaining a rain garden, vacuuming, permeable paving? Lauren,
this is
or Margot?
yep. This is Sarah. I was just going to jump in and just offer that. Yes, we've received questions, and the biggest question we've received is, would you be able to pay for the long-term maintenance or an ongoing initiative? It seems to be a difficulty for communities to be able to, increase their annual operating budget to be able to work that in. And many cities and towns are operating by the skin of their teeth to begin with. So it's one thing to get a grant to be able to install the initial setup, but it's another thing to be able to then have to go back to your town meeting or your city council, depending on your local structure, and request that line item to be added. It can't be done without the other, and it shouldn't be. And one of the reasons why I think the approach that we've taken in Massachusetts is one that we're so proud of, is that for all of the actions that we've identified, at least at the state level, and we hope our communities follow suit, is we've analyzed where we're going to get the money from to do it. We've made sure that it's something that's viable. It's either already in the operating budget, or it's something we can identify through bond or through some other place. And if there isn't funding for it, then it's not something we're going to do in the next 5 years. It's something we're going to keep on the table as a good idea that we're going to try, achieve that funding for. But you need to be able to coordinate across city government and across budget to be able to make sure that the priorities are aligned. And certainly if it's a great idea and it would minimize, flooding to a parking lot, but it's not really something that has an overall impact, then maybe it's not something that the community at large is going to get behind. But that is one of the questions that we do receive most often is there funding available from the state or from the feds on an ongoing basis? And usually the answer is no. A lot of times these grant programs, at least the FEMA programs, it's a one-shot deal. You get the money, you can install it, but the reoccurring funding source is a very big challenge. We recognize that.
Excellent. Anything more, Lauren or Margot? Okay. Another question. We have a lot of good questions here. Is there any pushback from landowners or politicians for putting information about flood risk into the public realm or placing high watermarks on land?
I'll jump in. This is Lauren, since I know it's a high water mark image. Yes, but also not always. You find after a large event, so in this case, Tropical Storm Irene, there really is this outpouring of community support and cohesion. And if you can really capitalize on that following an event, you're more likely to get buy-in, not only for landowners to say, oh yeah, my field that I'm not using, sure, you could do floodplain restoration down there. But also, yeah, I live along a road and I have a large parcel, sure, please put a high watermark sign in my yard. The further you get away from an event, and here in Vermont we call it Irene fatigue or resilience fatigue, the less likely you might be, or the less interest there might be garnered around such outreach efforts or campaigns. But it's really important to be able to speak candidly and openly with private landowners who might be concerned about that. I know high water marks in towns and villages across Vermont are usually well received, but sometimes are a scary thing to put out there to say, hey, look, you're considering moving to this village, or you're a business owner who's interested maybe in starting a business here, and you see this high water mark looming over your first floor. That can be a concern, but they really are treasured historic markers in Vermont, and they're really good education outreach materials. So we try to promote where we can.
Okay, excellent. How did you calculate the avoided damages for your projects? Margot or Lauren?
This is Lauren. Happily, I didn't have to. I'm biology by background and not engineering, but usually the engineers are really responsible for coming up with those values and those valuation determinations.
Okay. So finally, are there any lessons learned that any tips you would give out to this audience? Any advice? Starting with Sarah.
Thank you. Well, just because this is probably the last time I'll speak, I want to thank everybody who's still paying attention to our talk. And, I wanted to convey that one of the things that we're really proud of is not the plan or the shiny data or, the tracker that's really an Excel spreadsheet or the award. All that stuff is great. But what's really important, and I'm not exaggerating this when I say it, is the personal relationships that we have built between the different state agencies across state government. All 9 of our secretaries that report to the governor were told that this is a priority of his administration, and they participated with us through this process. And the same goes true in cities and towns when they go through the MVP process, where they are all sitting in a room, sometimes 40, sometimes 50, sometimes more stakeholders that are really there to work together to solve a common problem. And it's really the relationships and the conversations that happen around those tables where the real benefit is. And not everyone agrees. Sometimes there are disagreements. Sometimes there's things that come up, such as, pushback from a business owner. We don't want to, talk about it like that, or they're concerned about the way it might look or appear. And you just have to work through those openly and honestly, because the reality is, flooding is a reality for a lot of our communities, as well as some of the other hazards, severe weather, erosion, et cetera. It's stuff that we need to deal with together, working together as a team. It does not benefit anybody to have the engineers over in one corner and then transportation over in one corner and planning at another table. We all need to sit together and see where we can achieve maximum benefit from whatever it comes from us. You'll see that in Massachusetts I work at the Emergency Management Agency. For the most part, we support our cities and towns' emergency response. But the person I talk to probably more than anyone else, even in my own office, is Margot, who works at the Executive Office of Environmental and Energy, because we really work collaboratively on making sure that we're reducing our risk to our hazards. And the only way to do that is to build those relationships.
Thank you. Anyone else? Lauren or Margot? Any more advice? Any more tips on to this audience?
Yeah,
I'll jump in. Margot, go ahead.
Okay. I also want to reiterate Sarah's thank you to those of you who have listened in on our webinar today. And I'll offer something a little bit different in that, for the MVP program, we really saw this as this planning phase as sort of an initial or as a catalyst to reignite energy that might have already been started, but that it's a repetitive process. And the program only gets you maybe 8 hours of stakeholder engagement, which is not going to solve everything. It's not going to get into very detailed, specific actions, but it's a starting point. As I said in my presentation, it's a blueprint and that for those nature-based projects, it's unrealistic to go from just an idea that came out of group think tank to on the ground. That there are phases involved with that as well, starting with more detailed analysis, conceptual and design plans. So there is a journey into seeing on the ground projects actually come to fruition, but that so to keep that in mind, I guess, as other communities start to think about these projects in the planning phase. And related to the funding conversation, one of the challenges we've heard is that because of when our grants are funded by capital funds, so we are restricted to fiscal year deadlines. So that can be a challenge of when to find local match, for example, for the action grants, when to find local match from town hall meetings, that you need to start thinking forward-looking and to start thinking of ways to set aside funding for municipal local match for grant opportunities down the road, even if it's not necessarily guaranteed when those come around.
Excellent. So any other?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Myra. This is Lauren for my goodbye. Thanks again to everybody who signed on and stayed on. I'll definitely reiterate Sarah's comment about breaking those silos and working cross-sector. You can find real synergies there and leverage funding that wouldn't have otherwise been made available to you. I'd also say integrating mitigation and nature-based solutions into your municipal or city planning efforts or capital improvement planning is huge. It's key. People don't necessarily think of avoiding disaster or reducing vulnerability as a capital planning effort, but it really is. And sometimes it's hard to put aside money for those proactive, progressive approaches, but they really will save you money down the road. And finally, I'll just say as a plug for those mitigation grant programs that Sarah talked about earlier, there are grant opportunities open right now. So FEMA recently released their Notice of Funding Opportunities for Pre-Disaster Mitigation, PDM, and Flood Mitigation Assistance, FMA, for the 2018 year with an end of January deadline. So I would say contact your city or town or your state to figure out more about those. If you have projects in mind, now's the time to go after it, because FEMA is recognizing that we should be putting more energy into these mitigation efforts, and there's a lot more money available. So if you have something, try to go get it.
Thank you. So great job. I want to conclude by briefly mentioning the EPA Soak Up the Rain resources that are available on our Soak Up the Rain website that you see a screenshot on right here. And it includes a comprehensive collection of tools and resources for doing green infrastructure and nature-based solutions and approaches. A lot of these tools are customizable to your organization, that you can use them for outreach. So finally, I want to thank our speakers for sharing their great work, which will hopefully inspire you to do the same in your state and your communities. Here's their contact information. If you want to follow up with them, including my contact information. And finally, I want to thank all of you for attending, George Burgos for his technical support, and hope you'll continue to join us for upcoming webinars. We want to remind you again about filling out the evaluation that you'll be receiving after this webinar. Please let us know of any topics you'd like to hear related to this one, or any other topics you'd like to see us include. So this includes our webinar today. Thank you.